Are Baptists Reformed? This is a very involved question with a lot of different angles, very complicated question. And I think it's a good question because it leads us into a discussion about not only Baptist theology, but Baptist history. One that I think has been in part misunderstood over the last century, and good intentions behind some of these things, but I do think that it's a discussion worth having. Are Baptists Reformed? And so when we use the word Reformed Baptist, we're going to talk a little bit about what that means here when modern Baptists call themselves Reformed. But then we're going to also ask the question about whether or not historically we can lay claim to that nomenclature, whether we can lay claim to the titling of Reformed. So we're going to look at that here. Welcome to the Baptist broadcast. It's good to be with you all. I took a week off last week. We were out of town for a couple of days, and so that obviously crunched my schedule. Couldn't get to the studio, but today and this week that's not the case. Good to be back with you all. We are located on any podcast platform that you can really think of: Podcast Addict, Anchor.fm, and so on. Hey guys, what's up? A quick word from this week's sponsor, tinybibles.com. If you guys haven't seen tinybibles.com, run over there and check it out. You can get these tiny Bibles on there, handy for missions, those countries where you have to smuggle Bibles in. This can be very helpful. The kids love it. It's a great historical point as well. These tiny Bibles began production in 1896 by a man named David Bryce of Glasgow. And they were produced for soldiers. They were produced for the soldiers of the British Empire. Then we carry them around. And they have almost what appears to be microscopic lettering. It's amazing, the typeset and how clear the typeset actually is. And it comes included with a magnifying glass. Guys, again, the kids love it. If you are a missionary in a country or aspiring missionary to a country that has outlawed God's word, consider tiny Bibles. They're easy to move around, easy to pack in places that authorities may not check. Go ahead and check out tinybibles.com. God bless you guys. Thanks for listening. Are Baptists Reformed? Very complicated question. Anytime you get into historical language that applies to a particular movement, you're getting into very difficult waters. The reason you're getting into difficult waters is because language changes and the use of language changes over time. The reason we're not speaking Old English and the reason we're not speaking Elizabethan English is because language obviously changes. And the reason we don't use some words to refer to some common thing and we use different words is because language changes, and that's just a fact of life. It's a fact of history. And so when it comes to something like Reformed, which applies to a movement that may or may not include some certain kinds of groups or traditions, you're automatically asking a very complicated question about who this word applies to and who it does not. Now, I'm going to make some qualifications, and the qualifications are going to be along the lines of the word Reformed itself and different senses in which it may apply. So we're going to look at that. But I think what we need to do is we need to begin by looking at a couple of things. Number one, I want to look at the word Baptist. Now, this may seem like an odd place to start. This is a podcast episode about the word Reformed. Why am I starting with the word Baptist? Well, again, going back to the overall point that language changes, I think it's very important to note that the earlier Baptists, the Baptists in the 16th century, 17th century, did not call themselves Baptists. The language Baptist, or the title of Baptist, comes later on in the literature. So if you back all the way up to the 17th century and you look at Baptist confessions, you're not going to see Baptist confessions of faith, quote unquote. All right, you're going to see confessions of faith that come from baptized churches or baptized congregations. So the first thing I would like to do is look at the 1644, the First London Baptist Confession of Faith, and that name is anachronistically given. It was given later. The title of the confession itself is not the 1644 London Baptist Confession of Faith, just like the Second London is not, the title is technically not the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. We'll look at that as well. The other piece of the puzzle here that I would like to, the other connection I would like to make is that between the Reformed churches and their view of who we now call the particular Baptists, that they were Anabaptists. And part of the reason that the Reformed churches in the 17th century did not view the particular Baptist churches as Reformed was because they had an underlying assumption. I don't think their case could be proven given the actual data, but they had the underlying assumption that the particular Baptists were Anabaptists. Now, the particular Baptists themselves deny that titling. They deny that that nomenclature or that designation, and they do so on the cover page or the title page of the 1644, the First London Baptist Confession of Faith. So let's look at that right now, and I'll bring it up here on the screen. I feel sorry for you guys listening to the podcast version of this because you can't really see this, but I got to give credit where credit's due. I'm sourcing this from the Angus Library and Archive, and so there's a handy way to actually access these images. It's associated with Regent's Park College, which is part of Oxford. But I have to credit Sam Renahan, Dr. Sam Renahan, for this. I found the Angus Library and Archive through his website, pettyfrance.wordpress.com. Of course, Regent's Park College, as I understand it, is an organization he's done work with in terms of scholarship. I'm not sure if these pictures are actually his or if they come from somewhere else. I know that he has uploaded a great deal of imagery on his own website. So thanks, Dr. Sam Renahan, for this, and Angus Library and Archive, which is where these pictures come from. So just to be very clear about that, that's where I'm getting these. I stand on the shoulders of others. There's very little original to me that I do. So this is one example of that. So if you look at this is the First London Confession, the title page for the 1644. I believe this is the first edition because it says they're printed in the year of our Lord 1644. So a couple of things that I would like to look at here. Notice that the actual title of the confession is The Confession of Faith of those churches which are commonly, though falsely, called Anabaptists. So the Baptists of the 17th century, Benjamin Keach would have been involved in the Second London Confession. In this confession right here, William Kiffin would have been involved. I'm not sure if Keach would have been involved or not. I think it would have been before his time, but I could be corrected on that. William Kiffin would have been involved in the drafting of this confession. These are Baptist men that, Baptists today would very much look up to on either side of the debate as to whether or not Baptists are Reformed. And one of the things that you get here in the 1644 is the very clear distinguishing between these baptized Christians and Anabaptists. Basically, the framers of this confession are saying, we're not Anabaptists. We're accused of being Anabaptists, but we're not. Now, remember that the reason that the Reformed churches in the 17th century, made up of mostly Paedo-Baptists, Paedo-Baptist Presbyterians and Paedo-Baptist Congregationalists would not have technically been considered Reformed then, I don't think either. But made up of Paedo-Baptist Presbyterians would have said, well, part of the reason the Baptists, quote unquote, aren't Reformed is because we believe that they're Anabaptists. Anabaptists are not. They're schismatics, they're heretics, we denounce them. That's what they would say. I don't believe that all Anabaptists were heretics, by the way. I think there were some fringe groups. I think there was some groups that were decent. That's another very complicated study off on its own. But what the Baptists are saying here in this confession is we're not Anabaptists. We're distinguished from Anabaptists. And one of the arguments made against calling Baptists Reformed today is that the Baptists of the 17th century and onward and on into today are just a continuing tradition of the Anabaptist movement, which would have been termed during the time of the Reformation as the Radical Reformation, and obviously existed before the Reformation proper. You're looking at 14th, 15th century, 15th century especially, that you get some late 15th century literature from Anabaptists. Balthazar Hubmaier, I'm thinking of 15th, 16th century material there, and so a lot of today's Baptists that would be against calling the Calvinistic or particular Baptist movement Reformed would say, well, we're not Reformed because we were Anabaptists, we preceded the Reformed movement, and so we're not Reformed. That designation cannot apply to us. But the problem with that is that the Baptists in the 17th century the particular Baptist movement of the 17th century were consciously denying their association with the Anabaptist movement of the Radical Reformation. And they do so here on the very front page of the 1644. Now, they don't do so as clearly in the Second London. That is, it's not included so much on the title page, but in the letter to the judicious and impartial reader, it becomes very clear that they've associated themselves with the Protestant movement. Wholesome Protestant doctrine is how they put that. We'll look at the cover page of the Second London here in a moment. So notice a couple things about the cover of this. Notice they're not called Baptists, or they're not calling themselves Baptists, and they are disassociating themselves from the Anabaptist movement, which was one of the reasons why Baptists were not considered Reformed, is because they were seen as being linked with the Anabaptists. That's a Paedo-Baptist Presbyterian sentiment. That's not a sentiment that was imbibed by the Baptists themselves. They distanced themselves from the Anabaptists. And so those are the two things that I wanted us to note about the cover page of the First London. Let me bring up the cover page of the Second London. And we'll see even here, you're looking at some decades later, and they're still not calling themselves Baptists. What are they calling themselves? Well, you see the title. It's a confession of faith put forth by the elder and brethren of many congregations of Christians, baptized upon profession of their faith. They're the baptized congregations, we could say, in London and the country. So the Association of Baptist Churches just were distinguished in virtue of the fact that these are congregations that are baptized upon profession of faith, and in that way they're distinguished from the Paedo-Baptists. That's one of the major differences between this confession of faith and the Westminster Confession of Faith is baptism, the ordinance of baptism, the covenant theology that's really inherent to really the whole, in a way it's laced throughout the whole confession as an assumption, from the chapter on God's covenant onward at least. But the other thing is they are distinguishing themselves ecclesiologically. So also there's a different form of church government that they have adopted that is distinct from Presbyterianism, and that is Congregationalism. All right, so they align with the Savoy Congregationalists in terms of their church polity. They drop the infant baptism and they move to a credo-baptistic position based on their conviction from the Scriptures. Most of the rest of their theology is very similar to what would be found in the Westminster Confession of Faith. And part of the project of the Second London is saying, here's where we differ, here's where we are the same. And there's a great deal of where they're the same, and there are some important points upon which they differ as well. And the purpose of this confession is to make that very clear. The letter to the judicious and impartial reader that you should get in the leather-bound confession that was sold by Solid Ground Books for many years, and I think now you can get different editions. Broken Wharf, I think, puts one out that has the letter to the judicious and impartial reader at the beginning. All of the confessions, all of the Second London confessions that are printed today should include that as a preface. They don't always. But if you can, get one with that preface. You can access one digitally on Broken Wharf's website, Wharfe, W-H-A-R-F-E. It's the old spelling.com, and you can find the digitized version of the confession on there, and it does have the letter to the judicious and impartial reader. And in that letter, you get language that associates their movement, their tradition with Protestantism. And so I'll just try to find that quickly here so that I can read part of it. I won't read all of it. But this is in the preface, and they say this. Where to start? Let's see. Of course, you have the long sentences, run-on sentences in the 17th century, so popular then. One thing that greatly prevailed with us, this is their words, one thing that greatly prevailed with us to undertake this work, the work of this confession, was not only to give a full account of ourselves to those Christians that differ from us about the subject of baptism, but also the profit that might from thence arise unto those that have any account of our labors in their instruction and establishment in the great truths of the gospel, in the clear understanding and steady belief of which our comfortable walking with God and fruitfulness before him in all our ways is most nearly concerned, and therefore we did conclude it necessary to express ourselves the more fully and distinctly, and also to fix on such a method as might be most comprehensive of those things we deigned to explain our sense and belief of, and finding no defect in this regard in that fixed on by the Assembly, the Westminster Assembly that produced the Westminster Confession, finding no defect in the things they agreed upon, and after them by those of the Congregational way, the Savoy Declaration, I think John Owen and Thomas Goodwin, we did readily conclude it best to retain the same order in our present confession. And also when we observed that those last mentioned did in their confessions, for reasons which seemed of weight both to themselves and others, choose not only to express their mind in words concurrent with the former in sense concerning all those articles wherein they were agreed, but also for the most part without any variation of the terms, we did in like manner conclude it best to follow their example in making use of the very same words with them, both in these articles, which are very many, wherein our faith and doctrine are the same with theirs. And this we did more abundantly to manifest our consent with both in all the fundamental articles of the Christian religion, and also with many others whose orthodox confessions have been published to the world on the behalf of the Protestant in diverse nations and cities. So basically what they're saying there is we don't want to clog religion with new words. We're not making up anything new. We do have some differences with the Westminster Assembly, but we also have hearty doctrinal agreement. We're going to make those areas known, but we're also going to make the differences known as well. And then they go on, they say, and also to convince all that we have no itch, what I just said, that we have no itch to clog religion with new words, but do readily acquiesce in that form of sound words which hath been, in consent with the Holy Scriptures, used by others before us, hereby declaring before God, angels, and men our hearty agreement with them in that wholesome Protestant doctrine which, with so clear evidence of Scriptures, they have asserted. Now, you can use the word Protestant very broadly. Here, I think they're using it in a more strict sense, in the sense that we would say Protestant Reformed. They're obviously not talking about Lutherans so much as they're talking about the Paedobaptist Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. And perhaps the reason they chose the word Protestant instead of Reformed is because they wanted to include the Congregational tradition as well as the Paedobaptists that would align more closely with Presbyterianism. So they say that the Protestant doctrine, I don't think they have so much in view Lutheranism, although I will say that there was a fair bit of interaction between the Baptists of the 17th century and some of the more influential Lutherans of the 16th century. Some fruitful interaction, some interaction that showed that they actually had some agreement on some very important biblical theological items. But here, I think they're mainly concerned with saying that they have a agreement with that wholesome Protestant doctrine, which is found particularly in the Savoy and the Westminster Confessions of Faith. And so that word Protestant, I think is being used more strictly than just a kind of a broad, inclusion of the entirety of what could have been called Protestantism in the 17th century. Some things indeed are in some places added, some terms omitted, and some few changed, but these alterations are of that nature as that we need not doubt any change or suspicion of soundness in the faith from any of our brethren upon the account of them. So they're doing a couple things. They're in the same spirit of the First London Confession, though the First London Confession wasn't as vast and specific. They're continuing in the same spirit of distancing themselves on the one hand from Anabaptism, and on the other hand, showing that they align with the Paedo-Baptist Presbyterians and the Savoy Declarationists, but also have some pretty important differences from both of them, both ecclesiologically and sacramentally. We're talking about the ordinance of baptism in particular. And so how does this all tie together, and tie into the question of whether Baptists are Reformed? Well, this is some important historical hold on, let me do that. This is some important historical biographical information that I think shows us kind of what the historical landscape was like back then. On the one hand, you have the Westminster Assembly and those involved with the Westminster Assembly who would say, no, these particular Baptists, they are suspicious. We think they're probably aligned with the Anabaptists. They because they believe in believers' baptism, that must mean they believe in rebaptism, and then that must mean that they are ideological descendants of Anabaptists, the Anabaptists of the Radical Reformation. And so they polemically, the Westminster Christians polemically engage the Baptists as such. And the Baptists are saying, no, we're not part of that movement. Here's where we agree with you guys. This is sufficient to distinguish us from Anabaptism, but also we disagree with you on baptism, and we'll tell you what our doctrine of baptism is, and we disagree with you on church government. We'll tell you what our view of church government is. It's why it's one of the longest chapters in the Confession, chapter 26. And so there's a bunch of different reasons. The other reason that the Confession came to be, the Second London, is because of various heresies. One in particular is very significant, and that is the heretic Thomas Collier, who traveled west, was sent out by a particular Baptist church, William Kiffin's church, to go and plant churches in the Westlands. And what ends up happening is he changes his doctrine substantially, departs from the doctrine of the Trinity, departs from the doctrine of the Incarnation. He rejects both of those as well as other things, and yet he's going around, representing the Baptist churches back in London and the countryside. And so now need has arisen for the Orthodox particular Baptists to distinguish themselves from heretics like Thomas Collier, who are in all practicality representing the Baptist movement in the Westlands. So it was a very difficult situation, and it was one of the reasons that gave occasion for the drafting of the Second London Confession. So all of those considerations, Baptists were not calling themselves Baptists in the 17th century. They were distinguishing themselves from Anabaptists in the 17th century. They were consciously trying to show their agreement with the Reformed, which was substantial, and they were consciously trying to also qualify their disagreements with the Reformed. You consider all of those things, and you can understand why, on the one hand, they're not being called Reformed because they're being mistaken as Anabaptists. But you could also see, on the other hand, why they should be called Reformed, because in terms of their confession of faith, they find agreement on so much with regard to the Westminster Confession of Faith that they really should be included in the Reformed tradition. So from a historical standpoint, you can look back and you could make a case that the Baptists should be understood as Reformed. They should be understood as being within the historical Reformed tradition. That doesn't really get us to how the word Reformed is being used today, and it doesn't really get us to some of the concerns that people have with the word Reformed in the first place. If you see the word Reformed as a moniker that that is purpose-driven to communicate the idea of reforming the Roman Catholic Church, as if the granting then validity to the Roman Catholic Church, as if it was a true church that just needed to be reformed. If you see the term Reformation within that light, then you could understand some concerns that would kind of ply against the word reformed. But if you understand the word reform as a moniker that applies to the overall need, specifically in the 16th century and the 17th century to some extent, to reform not the Roman Catholic Church, granting therefore validity to it as a true church, but to reform the general political and theological atmosphere of those 2 centuries, then I think the Baptists should be numbered within that tradition. And I think the Baptists would have numbered themselves within that tradition if you were to ask them point blank. The language in the preface to the Second London is pretty clear that they're identifying themselves as those who confess and believe in that wholesome Protestant doctrine. And what they're doing by saying that is they're not granting validity to the Romish institution as if it were a true church that just needed to be corrected a little bit. What they're doing is they're saying that, no, doctrinally, we find ourselves within this same movement. We are partners, and we are here to do the same things. That is to resource the Scriptures and to publish wide, wholesome, true biblical doctrine, and to confess it and to remain steadfast within it. And if that's what the Protestant and the Reformed cause was, then Baptists should be numbered within that. The word reformed, even for the reformers, it was true that in Luther's earlier years, he saw a need to reform the Roman Catholic Church. His assumption was, Rome is a true church insofar as it goes. It's in error. It needs to be reformed. He changes his mind on that later on in his life, and he realizes that Rome is an apostate institution that needs to be thought of as such. Later reformers, like John Calvin, you're getting language in later reformers that would say, no, Rome is departing from us. And by us, they mean the true Catholic Church. We're the true Catholics. And you get this language in William Perkins in his body of work. Reformed Catholic is one of his works within his overall corpus of work. And he's talking about this idea of Reformed Catholicity, and by that he doesn't mean, we reformed the Romish institution. That's not what he's saying. For them, for the second generation reformers especially, and for the Reformed Orthodox of the 17th century, they would say that there's nothing Catholic about the Roman Catholic Church, and that there's nothing essentially churchly in a true sense. There's nothing churchly about it. It's not a true church, in other words. And so they're not making the argument that the Romish institution needs to just be altered and reformed. They're saying, no, the general overall political atmosphere of the 16th, 17th centuries needed to be reformed politically, and then the theological atmosphere. Remember, the Bible is just starting to be mass-produced in some way, and it's just starting to be translated into different tongues from, moving a step forward from the Latin Vulgate and so on. And so there's a lot going on here that suggests reforms happening actually on different levels, politically, personally, societally, the general social atmosphere. People are being enlightened as to the truths of Scripture. They couldn't read it on their own before. So this is all Reformation. And then you could even throw the Baptists in there and say really that between the First and Second London Confessions, you're looking at a continuation of the project of reform, in the sense that these confessions represent, I think, Otherwise, I wouldn't believe them. But they represent a refinement of Christian orthodoxy with regard to ecclesiology and baptism. And so they went further than Westminster and Savoy did, and they refined those two doctrinal areas. Whereas the Baptists could agree with the Westminster Presbyterians and the Savoy Congregationalists on things like the doctrine of justification and the doctrine of God and the doctrine of the Incarnation and all of these important principal doctrines that make a Christian, yet they differed from them in areas of ecclesiology in the case of Westminster and baptism in the case of Westminster and Savoy. And so that's, I think, very important consideration. The language of reform or the Reformation is used favorably among the Baptists, thinking particularly of Benjamin Keach. And I actually had a excerpt up here that I think is helpful. So this is coming from Tropologia. Metaphors, allegories, similes, types, etc., that respect the Church of Rome, the mystery, which he calls the mystery of Babylon. So here I have Keach obviously not granting a status of true church, and he's joining with the rest of the Reformation movement on that. The Reformation movement, whether you're talking about the Reformers or the post-Reformed or the post-Reformation Reformed Orthodox, the 17th century divines, they all agreed that the Romish institution was Mystery Babylon. They believed that it was the great horror and all of this, the Antichrist and so on. And one of the things Keach says here is this. He says, to reinforce this argument, and of course there's a broader context here, so it's difficult just to read this without going into that. But he says, to reinforce this argument, let any man that will become an advocate for the Church of Rome show that any people called the Reformed who dissent from the Church of Rome are guilty of like idolatry, and that the kings of the earth have complied with them in it, as aforementioned, and we will acquit this argument. But if this character doth more fitly agree to Rome than to the Reformed, etc., our argument is good. Now there he's essentially making an argument for the Reformed, and I would say even I would take a step further and say he's putting himself in that because he's arguing on their behalf and he's joining with them in the same belief that this Romish church is an apostate institution. John Gill speaks of the Reformation on numerous occasions. He says this, the doctrine of justification by the righteousness of Christ is a doctrine of great importance. The apostle speaks of it as if the essence of the gospel lay in it and calls the opposite to it. Justification by the works of the law, another gospel, Galatians 1, 6, and 7. It is a fundamental article of the gospel. Some have called it the basis of Christianity. It was the great doctrine of the Reformation. What our first reformers made their chief study, and by it cut the sinews of popery, the anti-Christian doctrines of penance and purgatory, of pardons and indulgences, of the merit of good works, works of supererogation. So there he calls the reformers our reformers, and so on. There's affectionate language in the 17th and 18th century about the Reformation. It's really not until you get to later generations that start to decry the Reformation as something that shouldn't be seen as being related materially to the Baptist movement, which kind of transcended it and came before it, and so on. So, should Baptists be called Reformed? There's one other consideration that we have to think about and talk through. And that is how the word Reformed is applied to the Baptist movement today. We've seen that historically the word Reformed did not insinuate the reformation of the already existing Roman Catholic institution. Perkins, Calvin, all of your Paedo-Baptists are clear about the fact that Rome was an apostate institution. In fact, you get some odd ducks like Richard Baxter, who thought that Rome just needed to be reformed. And the great majority of theologians during his lifetime in the 17th century would have disagreed with him, in my opinion. And I think the Baptists were the same way in the 17th century. They didn't see the word Reformation or the word Reformed as insinuating any sort of validity for the Church of Rome or the Reformation of the Church of Rome. They saw it as a reformation of doctrine that people generally believed. This is when the Scriptures are coming to light. The people generally have, because of the printing press, generally now have access to the Scriptures, and because of translation work and all of that, which before that point, translation work, the translation of the Scriptures into the vulgar tongue was a taboo, if not totally illegal, depending on the century that you're looking at. And so, following the Reformation, all of that changes. Then Reformation or Reformed did not insinuate any sort of automatic relationship to Roman Catholicism. Today, the way Reformed is applied to Reformed Baptist churches continues to avoid mixture or insinuation or relationship to Roman Catholicism. A Reformed Baptist church, if you're asking anybody who uses that word in their common parlance, if that's part of their vocabulary, what they mean by a Reformed Baptist church is a Baptist church that believes in the doctrines of grace. I would say that that's an insufficient kind of doctrinal designation. I don't think that a Baptist church that believes in the doctrines of grace is necessarily Reformed by itself. I would say the more specific designation of the term Reformed today in regard to Baptist churches is in relation to Baptist churches being confessional. So most people, if they're using the term precisely, when they use the word Reformed Baptist, they're referring to a confessional Baptist church, a Baptist church that confesses specifically the Second London Confession of Faith. That's seen as one of the Reformed confessions of faith of the 17th century. And so if a Baptist church confesses that confession, they are termed a Reformed Baptist church. Of course, within that confession are included the doctrines of grace. It's a Calvinistic document through and through, follows in the tradition of Dortian Calvinism. But there's more, right? There's ecclesiology. There is sacramentology, baptism in the Lord's Supper. There is other things, the doctrines of the covenant, and so on, that would distinguish a particular group as being Reformed or falling within the purview of Reformed orthodoxy. So, are Baptists Reformed? Let's turn our attention to Scripture. This hasn't been an episode on Scripture per se. It's been more of a historiography. But let's turn our attention to Scripture and look at Romans 14, verse 1. Now, Romans 14 is a chapter that largely deals with the doctrine of Christian liberty, which is a chapter in our confession. And the way Paul begins chapter 14 is, I think, very significant when we're talking about these kinds of discussions. Can Baptists be called Reformed or not? Paul says in the very first verse of Romans 14, "Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things." The evidence that we just looked at would suggest that there is an argument to be made for calling particular Baptists who confess the Second London Reformed Baptists. All right, there's an argument to be made. A historical argument and a contemporary argument can be made for calling particular Baptist churches Reformed Baptists. We do also know that there is concern with that language because of some of the misunderstandings that exist associating the term Reformed with Roman Catholicism and the Sacral Society and all of that. And so I would just caution everyone that gets into these kinds of discussions, can Baptists be called Reformed or not, to not make it a matter of fellowship. And we don't want to make it a matter of breaking fellowship, because, Paul in Romans 14, do not welcome those who are weak in the faith to disputes over doubtful things. We don't want to cause brothers and sisters to stumble over these kinds of debates. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't have the conversation, but it also means that we shouldn't become quarrelsome. We shouldn't become quarrelsome about them. I do think there's a very good case, historically and contemporarily, to be made that Baptists, following in the tradition of the Second London Confession, should, and even actually could, and even should call themselves Reformed. I think there's a certain utility to the word Reformed. Usually when somebody sees the word Baptist church, they're automatically going to assume it's Arminian, it's, engaged in some kind of easy believism. There's a lot of confusion with the word Baptist. That's just how it is today. Everybody and their brother uses that word to describe their kind of Christianity, and it's different all over the place. The utility of the word Reformed is that when someone is told that your church is a Reformed Baptist church, they have an instantaneous idea that, okay, if I go here, I'm going to hear scriptural preaching, and I'm going to hear it's going to be doctrines of grace. It's going to be confessional doctrine. These guys are more than likely, I'm not saying infallibly, but more than likely, these guys are grounded, and so we know that we can go there. Okay, so there's a certain utility to the way in which the word Reformed is used. Remember, English and every other language in the world changes, and words change in terms of their utility. This is why some forms of English are, Old English, for example, you wouldn't even be able to understand it. And there are words that were used for things back in the 40s and the 50s that are no longer used today. I don't walk into a restaurant and ask where the water closet is. I walk into the restaurant and ask where the bathroom is, and so, I'm not in London. I don't ask where the loo is in the United States of America. I ask where the bathroom is. So certain words change. Would it be wrong to call the bathroom a loo? No, it wouldn't. But is there a certain utility to the word bathroom in terms of the United States? Sorry to use the bathroom analogy, but it illustrates the point that words change. And there's a certain utility to the word Reformed today. And so if you're looking at a Reformed Baptist church, you're looking at a church that confesses the Second London. That means they confess the doctrines of grace. They're going to believe in expositional preaching and so on and so forth. They're going to have strong family orientation and so on. So hopefully that's helpful. We're at 47 minutes. That's a little longer than I wanted to be today, but that's okay. Hopefully this discussion, this is just kind of me talking through this issue. I didn't systematize it in a nice little tight outline. I just kind of started talking, and hopefully the pontification was helpful. God bless you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.